Hey guys, what's up? Disney Nuts here. How you guys doing? So today I'm going to show you how I shot this. Okay, pretty cool, right? Now, if you recognize this, it's obviously the show of Fantasmic that's done at Hollywood Studios. So I wanted to do a quick video here just to show you more or less of the settings that I used and lens and stuff like that. So that way, if you're on your way over to Hollywood Studios and want to see how to get how I got these photos, now you're going to know what I used. So for equipment, you guys probably already know I have a Canon R camera, which is I got a couple of years ago, and it is my first full frame mirrorless camera that I got. Loving it. A bunch of really good stuff that I've gotten on that camera. Now, as you guys know in my other videos, I did have Canon 80D. I still have it, and I do use the lenses that I have for that camera on this one with an adapter. And strangely enough, many of the photos that I'm going to show you here that I took at Fantasmic, actually with one of the lenses from that camera, and it was actually from the first camera that I got. So it's actually an old lens, probably one of the first lenses I ever got for my camera, and I'm still using it today. So the two lenses that I use, obviously you're going to need a telephoto lens. Now I haven't invested in the infamous 70-200 lens yet, because obviously it's around $2,700, and I know there's some Sigma alternatives for that, but I just haven't found the will to jump into something like that far yet. So what I am going to be using, as I mentioned before, is my 75-300, which is one of the first lenses I got actually when I bought my first Canon T3, and this one I got it off of QVC since I was paying in installments. Now obviously the mount for this camera is different from the Canon R, so I do have a mount that I got from Omlight, which allows me to connect the EF mount, which is what the Canon crop sensor. That way I can use it on the Canon R mount, which is what this new camera holds. And this lens, what I like of it, it's great because obviously you got the 300 reach, but it does have a downside, which is the f-stop. In this case, the more you zoom in, the more the f-stop is going to go up, which means it's going to make that opening to the lens really small, which makes it harder in dark light situations. Now don't worry, I'm going to explain one of the advantages of the show that we have here, which allows us to use this lens. Now the other lens that I'm using is actually the Viltrox, and I've done already a review of this one, which is my 1.8 85mm. Now obviously 85, although it's not as close as the 200 or even the 300, it does allow me to get some really good crisp shots, and you can do a pretty much heavy cropping and still have some really good usable photos, and I'm going to show you a couple of them into the computer here shortly. The first thing that you want to look for is the location as to where you want to sit when recording the show. Now what I always recommend people is to go to the second show, because the second show is always the one that has the less people. During some times of the year they'll probably bring it down even to one show, so make sure you check the My Disney Experience app to see when are the shows happening. Many times there's one that happens just before the park closes and one that happens right after the park close. In this case, we like to go to the one that's right after the park close, because many times, to be honest with you, it's empty and you can move around a lot, which is pretty cool. Now if you do have the advantage and you do want to try to get closer, go ahead, go for it. I like to sit a little bit farther back, because that way you're in an angle to the show. If you're too close, you run the risk of having people sitting at the same level as you and having heads covering the shots that you want to take. But again, that's a personal choice, of course. If you're closer, it's going to make it easier to get some of the shots. But for me, I like to be a little bit higher and over the heads of the people, and that way you get all the shots as well. And another thing that you want to remember is that there is water that comes out when the whale flips his tail and the water comes towards you. Now the show does not have the water where it hits the benches, but if the wind is happening that time, you may get wet, so be aware of that little detail there. When it comes to the settings on the camera, pretty straightforward settings that I'm using here. I'm going to be shooting on manual because I want to adjust all three components, what makes up my exposure. And the first thing that we're going to set up is actually our shutter speed. And what I like to use and what I've found that helps me the most is actually starting at 1/250th of a second, because I found that there is where I can actually freeze the most motion, but at the same time try to keep my ISO as low as possible, and that way I don't introduce noise into the photo. Now if you want to bring this up or down, it's up to you. It's just a matter of opinion, but as a starting point, when it comes to stuff like this for this show, I found that 1/250 of a second is what works for me. Widest f-stop possible, so whatever you have, lock it down to that number. Now, unfortunately, like I mentioned, in this case of this lens, as I go zooming in, the f-stop will change, but in the case of the Viltrox, it is 1.8 all the way, but since this is a prime lens, I don't really zoom in anyway. But if you got a lens that, for example, is like a 2.8 all the way, lock it down to 2.8, and that way we make sure we get the most light into the lens into this dark situation. Comes to the ISO, even though I am on manual, I do set my ISO to automatic, because it's one thing that I really don't want to tinker it at the same time. And you'll see in some of the shots I'm going to show you here in the computer that as we go taking photos, as there's certain scenes that have more light on the characters and some have less, the ISO is automatically going up and down, so it's one less thing I have to worry about. So again, I'm locking in the speed at 1/250 of a second. I'm putting my f-stop as the widest possible, which is the lowest number, and then I'm leaving my ISO as auto. Now the third one, which I think is probably the most important one that I've found that I've used that has helped me tremendously on getting these types of shots, is the metering. In this case, I use spot metering, because what I want to do is make sure that I'm only making sure that the camera is computing the center of the image, which is usually what has the light on. Now, if you've seen Fantasmic, it's a great show. It's obviously dark, but there is spotlights of stuff that's happening, and that's what we want to capture. We don't want the camera to go out and try to compute the whole scene, because what's going to happen, our ISO is going to come up and we're going to introduce a lot of digital noise into the photos, which we don't want. So using spot metering, and I'm going to put a video right up here which explains the type of meterings that these cameras have. Make sure that the camera then uses only the center of the screen to adjust the settings of the ISO. Now, just as I'm using spot metering, I am also going to use spot focus, because that way I make sure that I am focusing on the center of the image. Now, when it comes to metering, I also want to say that remember that in case of the Canon cameras, when it comes to metering, and I'm using spot metering, it will use the center of the camera, in this case the center of the frame. So there is no way to move that around the screen like you would do with spot focus. So be aware that when you're shooting in spot metering, you need to make sure that what's lit is right dead center into the image, okay? This was tinkering with the camera, and obviously you see 1/60 of a second, you're gonna get that blur in there, so it's something that I do not recommend. Like I said, 1/200 of a second, 1/250 of a second is where I started seeing the best results. Here, for example, this was 160 still, you know, there's some, you know, motion there. So basically lost shots here. And then here's where I started tinkering with the 250. You can see here, I can already zoom in and everything starts to look a little bit more sharp. And even though there's a lot of noise in this photo, because obviously it's shot at ISO 25,600, you can still see that it is in focus, which is what we want. Other shots here, for example, here, as you probably know, Fantasmic has some two new additions, one being a scene from Elsa and one from Moana. Here is the part where Elsa comes out. What I recommend is actually wait until the water stops for them to be able to take the photos, because what happens, your camera's going to try to focus on the water spray that's in front, and once it stops you can get photos like this. As you can see, I shot this at 1/200 and this one at more or less at, like I said, 250 of a second. And as you saw, when I zoom in with this lens, the f-stop is going to go up. In this case, it went up to 5.6, which is, as you can see, it's still not bad as a wide f-stop, but note that when you're zooming in with that type of lens, the f-stop goes up. Here's a couple of other scenes. Here's Moana, you know, putting her hands in the water. Here's another one that I took and I lowered it down to 1/200 of a second just to see how, you know, how it would come out, and actually came out pretty good. Then when the floats start coming out, where Belle and the Beast and all the other ones, and Snow White and Cinderella, I went back to 250 because, like, you know, those floats are moving, so you're going to get, there's a lot of motion going on. So I wanted to put in 250 and lock it down to that. And that's what I was using from that moment on. And you can see here, this is 250 a second, f-stop 5, which is not bad. And again, I'm using spot focus and spot metering right in the center, which is why then the camera is adjusting the ISO to that. If, as you can see, at 6400, if I would have adjusted like a center weighted, or maybe one of the other ones which are value to metering, which would have taken consideration the whole frame, I guarantee you the ISO would have gone way up. Here are a couple of other ones just to give you some ideas that I took. This was already when she was literally right in front, so I zoomed all the way back, and since you see there's plenty of light right here in the center of the image, ISO went all the way down to 1600, which is great. So really good. And then there's a couple of other shots here that I took, the same thing when they're flying, when they're passing in front of us. This one I got really lucky that the evil queen's in the back here, which is great. Here I started putting my camera sideways. This is the size of the shot. I started putting it sideways because I wanted to get the angry queen here. Same thing, 1/250 of a second. And as you can see, thankfully this camera gives me pretty good photos at a high ISO, so I'm not complaining. So again, it all depends on the limitations of your camera. Here are a couple of other ones where she's here doing the same thing, and these are cropped. I want to make sure that you know that these are cropped. So for example, when I took the original image, she's actually dead center of the image, so that's why it looks like it's not, but it is. So just to give you a heads up. Here are a couple of other ones as well. And then here's where I switched over to the Viltrox, which is the 1.8. And like I mentioned before, one of the cool things of this lens is that you can actually take some pretty good shots and still do a really good crop. And obviously the reason is, since this is a native mount for the camera, which is the RF mount, so you get to use the whole frame of you get the whole sensor of the camera. Contrary to the other one with the adapter, you only use the crop sensor, which is the middle, which is, you know, somewhat putting the rest of the sensor to waste. But still, it's a good lens for types of shots like this. For example, here's one as the original shot, and here's the one where I zoomed in. It's literally the same photo. Here are a couple of other ones where I did the same thing. And you can see here's one all the way, you know, the original shot as to how it looks zoomed in. Okay, and then the final scene when the boat starts coming around. Again, some of these are unedited, so that's why you see a lot of noise here. Usually I try to clean this up, or you can just hide it with, you know, bringing down the exposure. But again, these are shot with the 1.8, so the good thing of that I can always, you know, zoom in a little bit and get a little bit more of the details if I want to crop out people and stuff like that. And at the end, obviously here I'll just pray and spray. At the end when Mickey comes up at the top of the mountain, there's a lot of stuff happening. I'm shooting here a lot because there's a lot of good moments where you can get certain things that's happening at the same time. Here I saved these two just for this video, so you can see there's some action going on here, some pyro going out the left. Here the pyro's going out from behind the mountain. There's a lot of lasers, and everything is nice and sharp. For example, we can see here, let's give it a second here for Lightroom to load. You know, Mickey is perfectly sharp, which is awesome. And again, I'm shooting with the 1.8, you know, pretty much cropping this whole thing. So let me give you an idea of how much I'm cropping. So here's the original image, and you can see here how much I'm cropping. So don't discard having a fast lens because it's far away from what you're trying to shoot as something that you cannot use. For example, here is the perfect example. As you saw, using a 1.8 85, I'm able to crop in and get some really good shots, you know, like this one. Okay, and those are the shots here on the computer. Okay guys, so that's it, and that's how I shot these photos of Hollywood Studios. Hopefully you can use these tips and tricks and settings that I use for obtaining these photos for your trip, and that way you don't run into any surprises. Now, this is the first time watching these videos. My name is Dizzy Nuts Lewis, and as you see, I take photos around the park and hopefully share my tips and tricks that I've been able to learn throughout the years. So please subscribe to the channel, that way we keep them flowing. And until then guys, stay awesome. See ya. Bye.